Hello, my name is Helen Christians, and I'll be your MC this morning. I'd like to welcome you to the Sunday morning meeting of the Humanists of Greater Portland. This is a very special meeting because it's HGP's first attempt at a hybrid meeting. Over a year ago, we went into a Zoom format, and we're attempting to inch our way out a bit. Our goal as we come out of COVID pandemic is to return to Friendly House for in-person gatherings and include a live stream of the meeting for our distant members and for those who want to attend the meeting from their home. Dave DiNucci and Mike Brachet have been just working diligently to make today happen. The Humanists of Greater Portland is a chapter of the American Humanist Association. And as humanists, our members believe in a progressive philosophy that without supernaturalism advocates living an ethical life based on science, reason, and free inquiry. The American Humanist Association has developed a list of 10 commitments, and these 10 commitments are a gentle guide that puts our humanist beliefs into action. Our topic at today's meeting, the global situation of seafarers, will be highlighting a humanist-based foundation. In this presentation, it'll address all 10 of the humanist commitments, but especially social justice, empathy, global awareness, and altruism. Dave DiNucci is our Zoom host and also manning the mics at Friendly House. And now, coming to you live from the Keyston Lowry Room at Friendly House, I would like to welcome Pete and Paul Burkett, who'll be doing our first Sunday music. Thanks, Pete and Paul. Come on in.
And their old mother meet us at the station, dressed as black as a crow in a coal mine. She cried when a little girl stepped down from the train. Brothers and sisters drove down from Jackson, Mississippi, in a great green Hudson driven by a Gentile that they knew, drinking rye whiskey from a flask in the back seat. They tried to do like the Gentiles do. Christ, they wanted to be Gentiles too. Who wouldn't down there, wouldn't you? An American Christian, goddamn, got on the Dixie Flyer, bound for New Orleans, back to her friends and her family in the land of dreams. On the Dixie Flyer, bound for New Orleans, across the state of Texas to the land of dreams.
Oh, wow. Oh, Pete and Paul, thank you so much. And it was such a treat to see you in Friendly House and to see Friendly House. I mean, yeah, it's still there. It's still waiting for us to show up back there. And Mike's got his tie-dye shirt on, and we see a little bit of an audience, and we also hear some clapping. What a treat. Thank you so much. That was fun. Well, I now would like to welcome today's speaker, Jessie Braverman, who will be presenting on the global situation of seafarers. Ms. Braverman is the chairperson of the Pacific Coalition of Seafarers. The Pacific Coast Coalition of Seafarers is made up of many diverse and unique organizations that include human rights and immigrant organizations, trade unions, seafarer welfare organizations, and other institutions. The Pacific Coast Coalition of Seafarers' mission is to enjoin these diverse community members and organizations along the Pacific coast to fight for the dignity, rights, and welfare of seafarers. Welcome, Jessie. Come on in.
No, it's an honor. I'm excited to be part of this new hybrid in-person online thing y'all are trying.
Let's see how it goes. We're on new waters, that's for sure. So this is your perfect presentation for this hybrid format. Okay, and I'll go forward as you tell me.
Great. Thank you so much. I
You're
appreciate
welcome.
it. Thank you to everyone on this call for having me today. It's really an honor to be here with people who care so deeply about the collective well-being of others and really the world as a whole. I think through this work, I've been really lucky to meet so many people dedicated to service and justice. And for that reason, I'm really excited to share the plight of seafarers with you all today, really as some of the most invisible and underserved communities across the world. So again, my name is Jessie. I'm the chairperson of the Pacific Coast Coalition for Seafarers. Our coalition launched in June of 2020, so last year, really in response to seafarers' worsening conditions during the COVID pandemic. And even though we just launched officially as a coalition last year, there's actually a very deep history among the community of Portland of really serving seafarers docked in our ports. We really formed after years of collaboration between port welfare organizations, human rights and migrant organizations, trade unions to support the needs of seafarers docked in the ports of both Portland and then Vancouver, Washington. But like I mentioned before, it was really COVID that kicked things into gear as we were receiving updates from our allies about really how seafarers were being impacted by the pandemic. Even though seafarers are some of the most essential workers in the world, they often go unseen by many of us who benefit from their hard work and labor. And as often forgotten migrant workers, they can fall through the gaps of aid and legal protection. And this has become glaringly clear during this global health crisis, where over 300,000 seafarers were stranded at sea with little to no protections from the multinational shipping companies they work for, and even their home governments. In the ports of Portland and Vancouver, on any given day, there are hundreds of seafarers combined between just these two ports, all who have been greatly affected by the pandemic. And while their situation is hard enough under the COVID pandemic, we know that they suffer harsh conditions and exploitation regardless of the pandemic. The problems that they're facing were not really caused by the pandemic itself. Rather, the pandemic exacerbated the problems of seafarers that already existed. So if you can hit the next slide, Helen. Thank you. Seafaring is really considered one of the most dangerous jobs in the world, and it's estimated that there are over 2,000 deaths a year at sea. This is because seafarers are constantly at risk of injury, illness, and accidents due to poor conditions and unsafe practices on board ships. I think just in the last few weeks, we've seen reports of seafarers being killed or injured at sea after their ship was overtaken by a wave, even a ship that broke in half during a storm. I'm sure most of us here also heard about the Ever Given container ship that was stuck in Egypt and blocking the canal for over a week. You know, there was a lot of talk and concern about the impacts it had on global trade, but think about how the workers were actually impacted by that situation, right? They were stranded on that ship for days without access to the basic resources they need to survive. And they were eventually scapegoated by the company they worked for, when in reality, the workers were the ones who were the most impacted. So seafarers are made to work in these really dangerous conditions and sometimes don't even know if they'll make it back home safely to their families through their contracts. If you hit the next slide, seafarers are expected to work at least 60 hours per week with long periods of work without rest, which leads to stress and fatigue. You know, if we think about ourselves and how hard it can be to function when we're feeling stressed or tired, imagine how dangerous this can be for seafarers who are overworked, having to perform really dangerous and intensive tasks on ships for 10 or more hours every single day. And if you hit the next slide, seafarers often become victims of something called wage theft, meaning companies will withhold large sums of money owed to seafarers and not pay them for the labor they're providing. They're being asked to do one of the most dangerous, most difficult jobs in the world, and then not even being paid for the work that they're doing. I think during our ship visits in Portland and Vancouver, this is really what we hear the most from the seafarers we meet. And even during the pandemic, they're not getting hazard pay because they're not actually being considered essential workers. I'll share a little bit more about the work of our coalition in a little bit later, but something we've been helping do is hold vaccination clinics for seafarers who come into port in our city. And it's really the companies who employ seafarers who are supposed to pay for them to receive the vaccines. But we've had a few cases now where the companies have actually forced seafarers to pay for their own vaccines, actually behind our back after we leave the ship. So this is really just another example of how seafarers are taken advantage of by these massive companies that they work for, whose profits actually ballooned during the pandemic. We also recently visited a ship where the seafarers were not even being given clean drinking water. Some of the captains and the higher ranking officers were being given bottled water, but the majority of the lower ranking workers were being forced to drink out of a rusty old faucet. And on that same ship, they were running out of food supply and were left to eat seaweed and onions for breakfast. They even opened their fridge for us to show us the food they had in the freezer. It was all improperly packaged and expired meats. And so really this lack of access to basic resources that they need to survive also presents extreme health and safety hazards in their workplace. And it's really a clear violation of their basic rights as workers and just as humans. Really, for an industry that profited immensely during the year of 2020 in the midst of this pandemic, I would think it would be a no-brainer that they would be able to at least afford food and water for their workers. If you hit the next slide. It is really dangerous for seafarers to speak out against these conditions and this very blatant exploitation of their labor. Because captains will often retaliate with physical abuse and even in some cases murder. There are countless stories I've heard of seafarers being thrown overboard and captains reporting it as an accident, and another seafarer who was thrown to die in a freezer for complaining about his mistreatment. Even in Vancouver just a few weeks ago, we heard a story of a seafarer who jumped ship, abandoned the ship. We're not sure why, but likely due to some poor treatment that he was facing. And so really, as the neglect, mistreatment, and abuse that seafarers face goes completely unseen by the rest of the world, the seafarers themselves face intimidation and threats for standing up and demanding the most basic rights that they deserve. If you hit the next slide. After 9/11, the United States passed something called the Patriot Act, which some folks I'm sure have heard of. This act had the intent to increase security measures across the country to combat terrorism, but we know that in practice, this act ended up in the violation of basic human rights for many migrants. And the way that this impacts seafarers is that it has made it a lot more difficult for them to obtain US visas. And if they don't have a US visa when they come into our ports, they're not allowed to step off the ship to buy groceries or just get a break from being on a ship all day, every day. And now, during this global health crisis, even if they do have US visas, they're not currently allowed to disembark from ships all across the world, including ports in the US, at all due to health and safety concerns. So the seafarers who come in our ports have literally been trapped in their workplaces. Many haven't stepped foot on land in a year or more since the start of the pandemic. So it's become pretty clear that seafarers have really been among the hardest hit by this COVID-19 pandemic, with more than 300,000 seafarers stranded at sea because the lockdown had prevented them from leaving ships when they arrive at port or even from flying home after their contracts have ended. There was initially an international ban placed on crew changes, and seafarers who were out at sea during the start of the pandemic were not able to return home even if their contracts were up. And while crew changes have begun again in the last few months, still not all seafarers are able to go home. It really depends on the responses from their home governments. And we're seeing that seafarers from places like the Philippines, China, Vietnam, India are not being allowed to go home as many of their counterparts from other countries are. Due to this situation, captains have been making changes to the contracts that seafarers originally signed. So many of them are being forced to extend their contracts, which are already almost a year long, and continue working throughout the pandemic because there has not been a prompt response from shipping companies or even their home governments to help seafarers return safely home. Internationally, trade unions and seafarers' welfare organizations are going so far as to refer to this situation as modern day slavery. As the Pacific Coast Coalition for Seafarers, we've been able to visit ships and really hear from seafarers directly how this COVID crisis has impacted them. And most of them have been on the ships for maybe 14, 16 months now without any communication on when they'll be able to return home to their families. We actually visited a ship the other day and heard from the seafarers that half of the Ukrainian crew on the ship had left that morning to fly home, but the Filipino crew members had to stay because there's still no solid plan in place from the Philippine government for them to be able to fly back to the Philippines or really protect them at all during this crisis. They also shared that many seafarers don't have regular access to internet while they're on the ships, which means they don't actually have a way to communicate with their families back home to let them know they won't be returning when they expected them. A lot of the seafarers we meet say they want to be able to video chat or send voice messages to their families, to their really young kids they have at home, but they don't have access to internet. So they've gone a year without seeing their families' faces or even hearing their voices. And so there's really this extra layer of impact added onto seafarers and their families as well during this time. I was actually in the Philippines this time a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago, and met someone whose father is a seafarer. And she was sharing what it's like to have your dad leave for 9 months at a time with minimal communication, working this really dangerous job and never sure he will actually come back home safely. All of this so he can provide for his family back home. And really, unfortunately, because of these grave emotional and mental impacts these conditions have on seafarers, there's been an increase in the amount of suicides committed by seafarers who are stranded at sea.
Okay.
I just wanted to share this specific incident that actually happened last year at the start of the pandemic. There was a COVID outbreak on a cruise ship called the Grand Princess cruise ship, which docked in the Bay Area. And like it will say in this video, all the passengers on the ship were able to disembark safely, but I think it was almost 600 workers who were primarily Filipino actually were forced to stay on board the ship without access to medical care as the virus was spreading, as many of them were really suffering with the virus. So this video, we'll talk a little bit more about the situation, but I think we can just watch it together.
Play.
So yeah, when we see things like this, it's really clear that this global health crisis has had such heartbreaking impacts on seafarers all around the world. But I think even more important for us to understand, like we said at the beginning of this presentation, is that a lot of the issues and problems that seafarers are facing were not necessarily caused by the pandemic. Rather, the pandemic exacerbated the problems of many seafarers that already existed. And I actually wanted to take some time and share a case study specifically on Filipino seafarers, which we've already been talking a little bit about. I really wanted to focus on Filipino seafarers, and it's really because out of the thousands of seafarers who are at sea every day, Filipino seafarers actually make up a quarter of the workforce of the global maritime industry. Most of the crews who come through Vancouver and Portland are actually comprised of Filipino seafarers. And this is actually really significant, knowing how small of a country the Philippines is. If you can picture it on that map, so tiny, compared to places like China and India, who are also the home countries of many seafarers. The average monthly pay for Filipino seafarers is about $450 per month versus their US counterpart, who gets paid $8,000 per month for the same job. And given this stark difference in pay, it's clear how big a role racism and exploitation of migrant workers plays in the practices of the shipping industry. So to really understand why Filipino seafarers make up such a significant amount of the maritime industry and why are they facing this humanitarian crisis, we have to understand the history of the Philippines and the character of the current Philippine economy. So the way we can describe the Philippine economy is that it's import dependent and export oriented, meaning that the entire economy of the Philippines is designed so that most of what is produced will be sold overseas for profit, rather leaving the Filipino people with nothing but cheap imports from abroad. This serves the wealthier business owners in the country who own the export industries, rather than serving the masses of people creating the products that they sell. The Philippines is so incredibly rich in natural resources, but the people don't actually see the fruits of the land they live on or even of their own labor. What farmers in the Philippines create with their own hands is taken away from them by big business owners who sell what they produce overseas at prices the farmers who created the products can't even afford. A story that I've heard that really it illustrates this is that the Philippines is one of the world's largest rice producers in the world, but it's also the world's largest rice importer. The farmers can't actually afford the rice that they produce, which ends up being exported to other countries at higher prices. And instead, they have to buy imported rice with plastic in it, even though the Philippines produces some of the most delicious and nutritious rice in the whole world. While the Philippines exports most of its natural resources, the country's biggest export is actually its own people. A byproduct of an export-oriented and import-dependent economy is a society with hardly any industries to ensure consistent employment. The Philippines has one of the highest overseas populations in the whole world, with at least 6,300 people leaving the country every single day. That's over 6,000 people leaving every single day to look for work abroad. Currently, there are between 12 and 15 million Filipinos living abroad and about 4.7 million in the US right now. And really for seafarers, not only are they considered the country's most valuable export, they are also made to export the resources that are leaving the country along with them. All of these migrants, seafarers included, are sending remittances back to the country, which add up to around, I think it's about $33 billion annually, which composes about 10% of the gross domestic product of the country. So these remittances are really the biggest chunk of income of the Philippines. And so I think with that information, we can really start to understand why Filipino seafarers and really all overseas Filipino workers are called the modern heroes of the Philippines, because the country depends on exporting its own people for its economy to survive. And even though seafarers are called heroes, they're not actually treated that way and are really the least priority of the Philippine government, as they fall prey to trafficking, exploitation, abuse, and often death. If you hit the next slide, really the way that this economy is held in place is through trade and labor policies created by the Philippine government and encouraged by multinational trade agreements led by the US. One of these things being called the labor export policy, which was put into place by President Ferdinand Marcos in the 60s. Some folks have maybe heard of President Marcos and his notoriously violent regime that declared martial law, which led to the brutal murder of many innocent people. But the labor export policy is actually a system of policies, laws, agencies, and even a culture where Filipinos are exported from the country en masse and treated as commodities. In addition, there is also something called contractualization, where workers are treated as long-term temporary labor without any job security or benefits. So this often leads them to seek stable employment overseas. So we can really see that the conditions of the economy in the Philippines really creates the situation that seafarers are in, right? These different policies lead to the exploitation of Filipino workers, and they're really at the root of this humanitarian crisis facing Filipino seafarers. So the seafarers are not only facing the COVID-19 global health crisis, they're also facing the real crisis of this system that's in place. So really, as most of the neglect, mistreatment, and abuse that many seafarers face, not just from the Philippines, but many countries around the world, goes completely unseen by the rest of the world, it becomes really clear how necessary it was for us to form the Pacific Coast Coalition for Seafarers. For the hundreds of thousands of seafarers still stranded at sea, those who will be without jobs to feed their families during this pandemic, the many more who will continue to suffer exploitation and fall through the gaps even after this pandemic is over. Those of us on land really must unite in solidarity with seafarers to amplify their voices and to make their demands known. And so this is really why we decided to launch our coalition, to establish a permanent campaign to monitor the conditions of seafarers and to advance their rights, and to mobilize the community to help meet their needs as determined by the seafarers themselves. You know, we really want to let some of the most invisible and underserved workers in the world know that we see them and we're here alongside them. So through our coalition, we've mobilized different faith communities, unions, other grassroots organizations through what we call community volunteer days, where folks put together care packages for seafarers filled with special snacks, toiletries, warm clothing that they need while they're out at sea, other health supplies, and even SIM cards so they can access the internet and talk to their families back at home. We've also hosted letter writing nights where folks can write their own letters to seafarers that we deliver alongside with the care packages. So these are all things that they have let us know they need because they haven't been able to disembark from their ships during the pandemic, and just some extra love and care to help them feel at home, even when they're so far away from home. And so this is all what we deliver to seafarers with our volunteers, right? As important the supplies are to them, it's really been so impactful for them to talk with the 1, 2, or 3 volunteers who are actually there delivering the supplies and representing our community to let them know that we're here for them. To see the joy it brings to Filipino seafarers when a member of the Filipino community in Portland comes to deliver Filipino food to them is like a joy I can't even explain in words. Next slide, we just have one more short video that's like footage from a ship visit we did recently.
There it goes.
Yeah, so that's just some footage of a ship visit we did for a whole Filipino crew. And so we were able to bring some members of the Filipino community here in Portland to visit them. But we don't focus just on Filipino seafarers. We actually fight alongside all seafarers, regardless of their nationality. So really, as of today, I think it's about less than 10% of seafarers worldwide have been provided COVID vaccines. Many have already suffered injury, illness, and death due to the virus and conditions aggravated by neglect from shipping companies and their home governments. This includes lack of testing, unsafe and inadequate quarantine protocol, lack of basic information and medical care, and really limited access to vaccines. And so while vaccines have become available to many people across the United States, as frontline workers, seafarers are still not being prioritized for access to vaccines. The United States reaps significant economic benefits from the global cargo trade and therefore must really be an active player in the solution, right? If home countries such as the Philippines, flag countries like Panama or other leading shipping companies are not actually upholding the rights and welfare of seafarers. It's also really the responsibility of the US government to ensure the rights and welfare of all migrant workers within their jurisdiction, which includes the health and labor rights, right? As a coalition based in the United States, we really see it as the responsibility for those of us on land to assert the US government actually lives up to this standard. And so while raising the demands for these basic rights to be upheld, our coalition has actually been taking urgent action to hold vaccination clinics to provide free vaccines to seafarers in response to the crisis, alongside the International Transport Workers Federation, the ITF for short, and other local healthcare providers. And since the start of our vaccine clinics on May 20th, we have helped vaccinate, I think, over 500 seafarers now between the ports of Portland and Vancouver. This photo on the screen is of one of the seafarers who we helped provide a vaccine to in one of our clinics. And since seafarers still really don't have access to shore leave, meaning they're still not allowed to step off the ship and onto land, we actually have to take the health clinic to them on the ship so they can receive the vaccine. And so as we're providing this service, we continue to amplify the demands of seafarers for governments to provide frontline workers at home and at sea with COVID-19 vaccines as really part of their longer struggle for dignity, rights, and welfare. I just wanted to end by sharing the coalition's vision, which is really to build unity between land and sea and communities in solidarity with seafarers. And so I really wanted to call folks here today to join us if you feel like you want to do so, right? To not let our action end here, but together let's continue to fight alongside the seafarers. As the seafarers are uniting to act as one, making demands of their home governments, ship owners, and manning agencies to stand up for their rights, all of us on land can also unite alongside the seafarers to amplify their demands to ensure their dignity, rights, and welfare. And before I end, I wanted to leave you all with some next steps for whoever here is moved to support our work. We're always in need of financial support to help procure the care packages and the other forms of support we provide to seafarers. So if you're able to donate or support us in fundraising, that's one huge thing that would help. We also need help packing and preparing care packages for ship visits. And this can be another opportunity to engage more community members. Hosting a volunteer day at your home or another public place is another way folks can support. And of course, the work of the coalition truly comes alive during what we call ship visits. So we would love to bring you on a ship visit where you can not only help to deliver care packages or help with our vaccination clinic, but where you can actually hear the stories and experience of the seafarers from themselves. So if you're interested in really bearing witness to the conditions of these invisible workers, really walking alongside them, then please reach out and we'd be really excited to schedule a visit with you. We go every week pretty much. So yeah, just wanted to say thank you so much again for having me today. I wanted to make sure we had ample time for questions and discussion. So I think I'll end my official presentation here, but was hoping we could open the floor to any questions, thoughts, ideas from all of you.
Jessie, wow, I can't believe you visit weekly, that you make weekly visits. But let's start with Ingrid's question. Okay, when on cruise ships, I have noted that each cabin pays a large amount of money to tip the ship staff. Is that where the seafarer's salary comes from? If so, what percentage of, quote, salary is the cruise line responsible for?
That's a really good question. I'm not really sure I know the particularities of it. I'm sure they do receive different tips from either guests on the ship, but I do know that the companies are definitely responsible for a base salary of the workers, and it really differs on the race, or actually the country that seafarers are from. So you'll definitely see that seafarers from places like the Philippines or India, their base salary is much, much lower than it would be for folks from the US or maybe an Eastern European country. But I don't know the particularities of your question.
Sure. And I think with the cruise ship, it's more the dinner staff that waits the table and the folks that are taking care of your room and put these cute little towel things on your bed. Certainly the ladies and men that are working in the kitchen, washing the dishes, keeping the ship running. There's no tips for them. I mean, there's no tips. Okay, for them. But anyway, thank you, Ingrid, for that question. Todd.
Hi, Helen. Thank you. And thank you, Jessie, for your great work and for an outstanding presentation on an issue that I didn't know as much as I should have before today. So my question is, this really seems like corporations run amok and just not caring about their workers, along with governments feeling the same way. And as humanists, we try and hold corporations and governments responsible as much as we can. So my question is there anyone in the shipping industry that has created a model that's taking care of its workers in the right way, or are all companies just conforming to a very bad standard?
Yeah, that's a really great question. From my understanding, really with the global shipping industry, it's really dominated by these massive monopoly corporations. So most of these corporations are not treating their workers well and are not following even global maritime labor standards. And there's so many loopholes that these corporations can actually make it through. So unfortunately, I actually don't know of any examples of any companies who are actually treating their workers well. It's really because the industry is so dominated by these massive monopoly corporations who it becomes really apparent they don't actually care about their workers or the people. It's really the profit that they care about.
So just as a quick follow-up, we talk about Monsanto being especially bad in agriculture. Is there one or two companies that we might be able to put some pressure on to be a leader, create a better standard in the industry?
Definitely. I think one to note actually is this one shipping company called ICTSI. It's a global shipping company, but it's actually owned by one of the richest men in the Philippines. I think he's now the second richest man in the Philippines. And his company is really well known for the serious exploitation of workers, both on the ships and also even against port workers here in Portland. I know that locally, the ILWU actually held a strike against ICTSI at a local terminal in Portland. And for that, the company just came down so hard in them with a really big lawsuit. And now even port workers here in Portland are facing really the exploitation from this company. But ICTSI recently also is known for the murder of workers in the Philippines. So recently, a labor leader in the Philippines working at an ICTSI terminal was murdered. And so I think this is one really notable company that we're still even talking about what are the ways that we can actually put pressure on them to take care of their workers and really expose what they're doing, right? If they're murdering their workers in cold blood, right? We have to actually stand up and expose what they're doing. So I think that's one company I think of note for me.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's, Dave DiNucci has, there's a question from Friendly House. Dave, let's give it a try.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for sharing with our group. I had the chance to listen to you, Jessie, when there was a rally down on the Willamette River. And that was my first experience hearing about you. And one thing you brought up was that sometimes the companies that the shipments are sponsored, they go bankrupt. And when that happens, what happens to the seafarers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's something that's actually really common. So when the companies go bankrupt, or even the ship that the seafarers are working on might break and they don't actually want to put money into fixing it, it's really common for seafarers to actually just be abandoned wherever they are in a foreign country. No passport, no documents, right? They're just left there to fend for themselves. No help from the company to actually return them home. So that's definitely one thing that international unions really have to come in and step in and help the workers. But it's just another example, I think, that these companies actually have no accountability to their workers whatsoever, so much that they can actually abandon them in a foreign country where they don't speak the language. They don't even have access to internet. Really, really neglecting them.
Joyce Lackey has a question. Come on in live, Joyce, and ask your question.
I'm wondering, Jessie, if there's have you reached out at all to see if similar coalitions can be formed in some of these countries that have the worst, for the Philippines, but India, to do the same kind of work beside yours? How do you get those formed, and then how do they put pressure on the governments and the companies?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, yeah, our coalition is really based on the West Coast, but we actually work with different international organizations. So, one is the International Transport Workers Federation. It's a global union that really focuses on specifically helping seafarers. Another one that's based in the Philippines, but serves Filipinos all across the world, is an organization called Migrante International. So internationally, they're focused on helping seafarers and really migrant workers all around the world and fighting for their basic rights, as well as something called the International Migrants Alliance. So, in our coalition that's really based in the West Coast, we actually have partner organizations who are based internationally and are already directly connected to migrant workers all around the world. And so I think that's one thing we're really lucky to actually learn from all of these international organizations and alliances who have been serving migrant workers for many years now.
I've heard that the fishing industry is worse than the shipping. That there have been, in fairly recent years, been fish products sold in pet foods in the United States that were derived from slave labor on fishing boats. I wonder if you have anything to do with the fishing industry, if you know if it's better or worse than the people who carry the goods across the country. Or is that even a worse situation?
That's a really good question. It sounds like you might even know more about the fishing industry, particularly than I do. I would actually imagine it's a really similar situation if you have these really big companies hiring workers from around the world. I would imagine that their conditions are pretty similar based on the different levels of exploitation that they face. I'm not sure if I would say one is worse than the other. I would say that actually their struggles and experiences are probably more related. And actually intricately linked together. But of course, would love to hear more from you too. If it sounds like you know a lot about the fishing industry, particularly.
No, I just learned about it because I had cats and I was buying cat food, and I found out that Nestle, which is often considered a bad corporation, did not want to have the problem of distributing fish caught by slave labor through its pet food subsidiaries, and that Nestle actually took about 3 years to determine that, yeah, there were ships selling fish in, I think it was Singapore, that had slave labor on them. It was the same thing as well. The ships came into harbor, but the people were never let off the boats, and they were essentially, Shanghai workers working under slave conditions. I've also heard that before COVID, there were about one person per month went missing from cruise ships and ocean liners, and it was mostly suicides amongst the crew. Uh, do you know how that situation has changed, if at all, from COVID? Or I guess I've heard that there's a lot less cruising going on, but is there anything done to try to help with mental health for these people on these ships?
Hmm. Yeah, from my understanding, the situation has actually gotten worse when there's seafarers still trapped on the ship. And actually, for them, it feels like they have no hope for when they can go home. So it definitely, the mental and emotional impact it has on them is a lot worse. I think too, to note in a lot of those cases, there are a lot of suicides, but sometimes shipping companies will just report it as a suicide. And in actuality, it was actually murder at the hands of a captain. And so sometimes it is a suicide, and sometimes it was actually higher ranking officers murdering lower ranking officers. But the company is working to cover it up.
Yeah, the article I read said that the cruise ships pretty much have video cameras everywhere, and that they were able to determine that it was a suicide from the video cameras. Although I guess maybe there may be some exceptions. I don't know.
Yeah. But that's definitely something that as a coalition, we understand that condition. It's something that we really want to provide for them, is even things as basic as like access to internet while they're in port so they can call their families, actually feel that connection to home, talk to community members in Portland so they're not just with the same 20 people on the ship every day. I wish I could explain, I think I said it in the presentation, but I wish I could explain the amount of joy that it gives them to actually talk to people, whether it's strangers, new faces that they're meeting in Portland or Vancouver, or actually their families back at home. And so that's really a lot of what we focus on. We're trying to get them their basic supplies, but really a lot of what they want is just human connection, and to not feel like they're alone. And so I think that's really one of the roles that our coalition can play for them, is to help them not feel so alone.
The book Secret Life of Groceries has a whole chapter on slave labor in the Thai fishing industry. So that's something that folks can look into if they want to know more about this. Jessie, I'm curious, what's your story? How did you get involved in this organization, this coalition? It's kind of an unusual thing. I'd really like to know your story.
Yeah, sure. So I actually first learned about the situation of seafarers. I am also a member of an organization called the Portland Committee for Human Rights in the Philippines. So we do focus specifically on the Philippines and fighting for the rights and welfare of Filipinos in the Philippines and in the US. And since so many seafarers are actually Filipino, that's the way that I really found out about the situation of seafarers, since a lot of the seafarers who come through our ports here in Portland are Filipino, right? It's like a really tangible and concrete way we can support Filipinos in their community. And so it was really through hearing about the situation from my Filipino friends, some friends that I have in different unions, about really the conditions that they're facing long before the pandemic. It really felt like a tangible way that we can take action for people who are in our own backyard, right? It was really shocking for me to even hear about these conditions, because I had never even heard of what a seafarer was before. I think that's really common for a lot of people not to know. And so that's really how I got involved, and just seeing how things were really worsening during the pandemic. A lot of us were like, it's really time for us to actually formalize a coalition, a network of people who are willing to take action in the day-to-day for these people who are in our ports and our own backyard every single day. So that was kind of like my path for how I got involved.
But it's so common to have those thoughts in your mind, but to actually do it, I mean, that's pretty amazing. It's pretty amazing. Uh, and how did you get connected to the Philippines community? Just through friendships?
Yeah, a lot of my friends are Filipino, and I was actually lucky enough. Our organization does something, they call it exposure trips, where folks from the Philippines actually invite us to go visit them in the Philippines, live with them, learn about what their lives are like. And so I was actually invited to join one of these trips, and I was able to integrate with indigenous peoples and farmers in the Philippines, really learn about their lives and a lot of the struggles they have. And so when I came back here, it really deepened my commitment to fighting for all of the people who I met while I was in the Philippines, but also all of the people that I didn't even meet, but I know who are living in the same situation. So just really like humanizing the issues. You know, it's easy to hear about so many issues happening and hard to choose like what specifically do we want to fight for, but it was really actually being on the ground, integrating with the people that I think really deepened my own commitment to fight for the Philippines.
So currently you're going out weekly to a ship, and and what happens I mean, you get ready to go. Tell us a little bit about just what that experience for you was like.
Yeah, sure. So we're really lucky to have so many volunteers. So that's why we're able to go multiple times a week. You know, it's not just the same people, but we have so many volunteers. But what we do is we go into the port, we pull up to the ship with our hard hats, our vests, our safety equipment,
Yeah.
our care packages, and
Yeah.
we're actually able to go on the ships now and meet with the seafarers. We often spend maybe an hour or two on the ships, just talking with them, hearing about their stories. And like I mentioned, what we're really focused on right now is providing vaccines to seafarers who
Yes.
come into our port. So when we go on the ship, we bring a pharmacist who we've been working closely with who helps run the vaccine clinic. We have folks helping line the seafarers up, making them sit after, giving them snacks, really just connecting with them. So that's really what a ship visit looks like right now, is actually helping run these vaccination clinics and then just spending time with the seafarers who really need it.
Yeah. Is it a different ship each time you go, or it is a different ship each time you go?
Yeah, the ships come in and out of port. Sometimes they're here for a day, sometimes they're here for a few days. So sometimes we'll visit a ship a few times if we see the seafarers. If there's something wrong, you know, we try to visit more often so we can kind of monitor the situation. But there's so many ships coming in and out of port every single day. So we try to visit as many as we possibly can to meet as many of the seafarers as we can.
You know, and the port in Portland is kind of hidden. It's not in, you know, we have the river and the river walk and all the stuff that goes with it. But I was up at Portland University in far north Portland for a class, and we walked around the campus, and part of it was going even to a very remote area on campus and looking into the bluff, over the bluff, and into like onto Swan Island and into the port. And I thought, I've never seen this. I've lived here for many, many decades, and yet I've never seen the port. And it's really quite hidden. You wouldn't know how big it was unless you found a spot to view it. And they're really good at hiding it.
Exactly. I know you wouldn't even know the ships were there, that there's, you know, maybe 100 seafarers there every single day.
Every single day.
Yeah.
Looks like Elle has another question. Elle, come on back in, hon.
I wonder if this problem of workers at sea where they have no access to rice, if that extends to the big boom in luxury yachts now. There are probably thousands of these yachts now over 100 feet in length that are owned by multimillionaires, billionaires. It became quite a status symbol for them to do that, to invest in those things. And I wonder if the working conditions for all the workers on those ships, some of them would have crews of approaching 100 people, I think. And if the I also wonder if you have a ship out at sea, if the ship owner has to directly employ the crew, or if they can just outsource that to some corporation in an obscure foreign country that nobody ever visits, and that they can say that, oh well, we don't even hire these people, we just contract for that. You know, it's what Nike does with a lot of factory workers in Asia. They don't dirty their hands by actually hiring directly. Is that kind of thing going on too?
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely a way for them to kind of absolve themselves of any responsibility in the situation whatsoever, as many corporations do really globally.
Suzanne asks, if you, how can we contribute? Just kind of review, just what would you help, the help you would appreciate from the Humanists of Greater Portland and our, and individual members.
Yeah, I'd be excited to hear too from you all what you would feel exciting contributing or participating. I think one is join us for a ship visit if you have openness to actually coming with us, meeting the seafarers, talking with them. The other really big thing is that we like to bring care packages to the seafarers with these really critical supplies. We try to spend between $10 and $20 per package for seafarers, but the costs really add up. So one really big critical way that folks can support, if you can't actually come with us and meet the seafarers, is just helping with fundraising so we can actually continue this really critical work to really provide much needed supplies to the hundreds of seafarers that come through our port every single week. Even hosting a volunteer day where folks can come together and actually assemble these care packages, right? There's so many care packages that go out. We actually need help putting them together. So that's another really tangible way.
And where do you meet? Where do you usually meet? Is there a spot that you usually meet to put those things together?
It really depends. We usually partner with different organizations who might host us in their church or community hall. We've been hosting some outside during the summertime to be COVID safe in a park or in an office that we share closer down to the port.
Wow.
But that's also something, is even, a space to host a volunteer day, something as simple as that is a great help.
And you're doing this weekly? You're doing the putting the packets together weekly?
Not necessarily weekly. We'll maybe host it monthly and put together a few.
Do you purchase? You must purchase the items, right? Because you know what you need.
Yeah, we have like a bunch of tabs saved on different websites. So yeah, based on the fundraising that we're able to do, then we have our list of places we go to
purchase the things. Sue Pierce is sending a message here. People who live or spend time in St. John's, Sophie Island, Hayden Island, or elsewhere near the mouth of the Willamette or the Columbia are well aware of the big ships on the Columbia and the Willamette and the ports. Yeah, so there is, you're right, Sue. It's just us Southwesterners don't see those places. Until I got on this little this class, then I did see them, and it was pretty amazing. It was an eye opener. But thank you. You're absolutely right. I'm showing my roots here. Well, Jessie, I think our questions are finished, and I really appreciate you taking the time to present to us.